You think someone like you can afford that jet? Travis sneered, his voice echoing across the showroom filled with stares and smirks. Without saying a word, Calvin reached into his shirt pocket, slowly unfolded a check, and held it up, revealing a figure that silenced the entire room. The air went still as every eye locked on the man they had just mocked, now standing in quiet, undeniable power. Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport bustled with energy as jets soared overhead and the polished floors of its elite private hangar showroom gleamed beneath the afternoon sun. In the midst of this modern-day temple of wealth and status, a figure stepped out of an old rust-colored pickup truck, its body battered by time and Mississippi dirt roads. Calvin Rhodes, 58 years old, wiped his hands on the sides of his faded jeans before tugging his cap down against the glare. His boots, caked with dried mud, clomped across the gleaming tiles like defiant echoes from another world. He wore a checkered flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing dark, calloused arms that had spent decades working the land. No Rolex. No leather briefcase. No polished Italian shoes. Just grit, sun-worn skin, and the quiet confidence of a man who knew the value of hard work. He moved with purpose, scanning the line of pristine aircraft that sparkled under the showroom lights like chrome-plated dreams. Each jet stood proudly behind velvet ropes, engines silent but powerful, like sleeping giants. Calvin's pace slowed as he neared one in particular, a sleek mid-sized private jet with silver wingtips and navy trim. He paused, resting a hand gently against its cool metal body. For a moment, his weathered face softened, his eyes reflecting something deeper than simple awe. This wasn't about status. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. This was about fulfilling a dream he'd carried with him since he was 10 years old and saw a crop-dusting biplane lift off the ground behind his father's field like a promise rising into the clouds. He was so lost in that memory that he didn't notice the stairs, at least, not right away. But they came, as they always did. From the moment he stepped through the door, Calvin had been met with the kind of attention that wasn't curiosity, it was scrutiny. Behind a polished desk, Travis, mid-30s, pale skin, gelled hair, crisp white shirt too tight across his chest, watched Calvin as if he'd stepped into the wrong world. His jaw twitched with something that wasn't confusion. It was disbelief, maybe even offense. A couple nearby, dressed in designer clothes and glossy entitlement, exchanged smirks. The woman leaned in close to her companion, loud enough for the words to slice through the air. "What's he doing here? Must have taken a wrong turn off the highway." Her laughter, thin and brittle, was followed by the man's muttered reply, "Maybe he thinks it's a museum." Calvin heard them. He heard all of them. But he didn't flinch. Didn't look away. Instead, he ran his fingers along the plane's edge again, like someone tracing the line between the past and the future. He turned and made his way toward the main counter where Travis stood, arms crossed, a tight-lipped grin already forming. "Can I help you?" Travis asked, voice sharp, as if the words were meant to gatekeep rather than welcome. "Yes," Calvin replied calmly, meeting his eyes. "I'm here to look at the Falcon 2000. I'm interested in purchasing." The silence that followed was loud. Travis blinked, then scoffed with a short laugh that he barely tried to hide. "That jet retails at over $25 million, he said, dragging out the number like a blade. "They're not usually the kind of planes people just drop in to browse." Calvin nodded, unbothered. "It's the kind of plane I've had my eye on for a while." Travis's smile faltered. For a split second, he didn't know how to respond. Then came the questions, rapid, condescending, laced with doubt. "Do you have an appointment? Are you sure you're in the right place? Is there someone else I can speak to? A broker? A company representative?" Behind him, more customers glanced over, their whispers thick with disbelief. One man, leaning against a display counter, chuckled. "Bet he's just here to take pictures. Probably wants to brag to his buddies back on the farm." Travis stepped out from behind the counter, gesturing toward the door. "Sir, we don't usually allow walk-ins without pre-clearance. Maybe you should start with one of the smaller charters down the road." They might have options more within reach. But Calvin didn't budge. He looked Travis dead in the eyes, expression as still as a stone. "I didn't come to play pretend," he said. "I came to buy." Travis opened his mouth to respond, likely to escalate things further, but the tension was cut by the sudden buzz of a phone ringing on the counter. He stepped away, irritated, and Calvin used the moment to take one last walk around the jet. He could feel the eyes still on him, but he didn't shrink under them. He moved slowly, reverently, like someone appraising more than just metal and technology. He was measuring respect, testing the weight of silence, feeling how far the room would go to keep him out. The sneers didn't stop. Another woman, perched beside her boyfriend, giggled cruelly. "Maybe he's applying to clean the hangar," she said, loud enough for several people to hear. The boyfriend grinned and replied, "Might want to start with those boots." And yet, Calvin said nothing. Not because he didn't feel the sting, but because he'd learned a long time ago that dignity wasn't something you had to shout about. It was something you wore like skin. Something you carried, no matter how heavy the world made it. He stood alone by the jet, hand resting once more on its fuselage, breathing in the sterile, expensive air of the showroom. Around him, laughter flickered like static. Judgment hung like perfume. But inside, Calvin was somewhere else, on his land back home, soil between his fingers, years of work turning sweat into savings. Every early morning, every harvest, every long night planning and praying and saving, it had all led here. Not for show. Not for them. For himself. For the boy who watched planes from a cotton field. For the man who never stopped believing that he could rise too. He didn't know it yet, but this day would be remembered. Not because of the check he would soon pull from his pocket. Not because of the jaws that would drop when it happened. But because this was the moment before the moment. The stillness before the storm. The quiet breath before a man chose not to be diminished. This was chapter one of a bigger story. And the air inside that pristine, judgmental showroom was about to change forever. The air inside the showroom was thick with unspoken tension as Calvin stood beside the jet, his hand still resting on its polished fuselage. Behind him, whispers continued to crawl like ivy along the walls, wrapping themselves around the cold marble floor and steel railings. He could feel every glance like a spotlight, not of admiration, but of mockery and suspicion. Yet he didn't flinch. Not once. He simply stood there, tall and unmoved, his fingers still brushing the cool metal of the Falcon 2000, the very plane that had lived in the corners of his dreams for decades. But what none of those people in that room knew was that this moment, this quiet defiance, wasn't the end of the story. It was the breath before the tide turned. Just as Travis approached him again, puffing up with a smug smirk and half-raised eyebrows, the entrance doors behind them opened with a soft mechanical hiss. Heads turned instinctively. And that was when the temperature in the room shifted. Striding through the door with the calm precision of a man who was used to commanding attention, Maurice Carter entered the showroom. His suit was a slate gray, finely tailored, hugging his broad shoulders with subtle elegance. The silver watch peeking beneath his cuff shimmered with understated confidence. He walked like a man who belonged, because he did. Every eye in the room followed him, but not with judgment. With respect. Travis's demeanor shifted the moment he saw Maurice, his posture straightening, his condescension quickly replaced by caution. Maurice's gaze scanned the showroom until it landed on Calvin. For a moment, something tender flickered in his eyes, recognition, maybe even pride. Then he was moving toward him with long, deliberate strides. "Calvin Rhodes," he called out, voice warm, smooth like mahogany dipped in velvet. "Well, I'll be damned. It's been, 30 years?" Calvin turned slowly, the corners of his mouth curling into a small but genuine smile. 32, he replied, offering his hand. They embraced briefly, two old friends from the same dusty Mississippi town, one who'd made his way to Wall Street, and one who'd stayed with the soil, his hands never clean, but his soul always grounded. The contrast in their appearance was stark, but their bond was something deeper than what any suit or boot could define. "I didn't expect to see you here," Maurice said, eyes glancing between Calvin and the jet. But then again, knowing you, maybe I should have. Before Calvin could answer, Travis stepped forward quickly, clearing his throat. "Good afternoon, sir," he said, his tone suddenly drenched in fake politeness. "If you're here to look at one of our jets, I'd be happy to." Maurice turned to him sharply. "You've been helping my friend here?" he asked. "Well, he came in without an appointment, and there was some confusion," Travis stammered, his smile cracking under the weight of the shifting power dynamic. Maurice narrowed his eyes slightly. "Confusion," he repeated, like the word had a foul taste. Then he turned back to Calvin, lowering his voice just enough. "Let me guess, they didn't think you could afford it." Calvin gave a single, slow nod. "They figured a man dressed like me was lost. Or dreaming." Morris's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. "Then maybe it's time we give them something to remember." At that moment, a man near the espresso bar, sipping something out of a tiny cup, let out a loud scoff. "Is this some kind of joke?" he said, his voice echoing. "Are we seriously pretending he's here to buy a jet?" He chuckled and looked at the crowd gathering behind him. "I thought this was a showroom, not a photo op for Rural Fantasy Hour." A ripple of laughter followed, sharp and shallow, like broken glass. Calvin heard it. So did Maurice. But only one of them moved. Calvin slowly reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. Smoothly, with steady hands, he opened it in front of everyone, the paper crackling slightly in the silence that had suddenly taken over. It was a check. The figures on it shimmered in ink, each number as real as the calluses on his palms. He held it up, calmly, without a word, and turned toward Travis. The room froze. Mouths parted but made no sound. Even the man at the espresso bar fell into a dumb silence. For a heartbeat, the entire showroom stopped breathing. Calvin stepped forward, voice low but resonant. "This check," he said, "covers the full purchase price of the Falcon 2000 behind me. I came here with intention. Not to browse. Not to pretend. To buy. But instead of help, I got whispers. Instead of respect, I got insulted." He looked directly at Travis. "So no, I don't need your assistance." Travis opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The confident arrogance that had painted his every move earlier was now replaced by the wide-eyed panic of a man watching a tower he built collapse in seconds. "Mr. Rhodes, I believe there's been some misunderstanding. Let's get you seated, perhaps I can." Calvin shook his head slowly. "You already told me everything I needed to know. So did the people in this room." Then he turned to Maurice. "I think it's time we head across the hall. I hear the folks at Aerostar treat their clients with dignity." Maurice grinned. "That they do." And with that, the two men walked out together. The silence behind them wasn't peaceful, it was loaded with shame. Loaded with everything no one had dared say out loud, now reflected in the quiet clinking of untouched wine glasses and the shuffling of guilty feet. Across the hall, the Aerostar staff welcomed Calvin with warm smiles and firm handshakes. No judgment. No hesitation. Just respect. They didn't care about the dirt on his boots or the flannel shirt. They cared that he was ready to make a decision, and that he'd earned it. By the time the paperwork was underway, Travis was standing back at his showroom's glass door, watching like a ghost from a forgotten empire. He had seen his sale walk away. But worse than that, he'd seen the mirror held up to his face, and what stared back wasn't pretty. Calvin didn't look back once. By the end of the day, the check was deposited. The jet was his. And every person who had once laughed, once whispered, once assumed, they would remember the name Calvin Rhodes. Not just because he bought a plane, but because he did it on his terms. Quiet. Composed. Unshakable. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded attention. He had simply walked in with a dream, and when the room tried to reject him, he reminded them that dignity doesn't need an invitation. It demands space, and earns it. This was no longer a story about a farmer in boots. This was about a man who had spent decades sowing seeds of sacrifice, of faith, of perseverance. And now? Now he was flying. And this time, no one could tell him otherwise. As the hangar doors closed behind Calvin and Maurice, sealing the silence and shock inside the showroom like a capsule of shame, the two men walked side by side into the sunlight with a calmness that didn't need to shout. Calvin's check had already delivered the loudest message of all. The rival jet company welcomed them with open arms, no assumptions, no hesitation, just the kind of dignity every customer deserved. But even as the contract was finalized, and the Falcon 2000 now officially belonged to Calvin Rhodes, a part of him knew the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because somewhere deep in that glass and marble showroom across the way, a lesson had gone unlearned. Not everyone could walk away like he did. Not everyone had a Maurice Carter to walk beside them, or a check to silence the scorn. Some would be turned away at the door, judged not for their intentions, but for their appearance. And that truth sat heavy in Calvin's chest. A few days later, in a quiet home office in Jackson, Mississippi, a young man sat listening to his father's voice over speakerphone. Jalen Rhodes, 35, was the kind of lawyer newspapers called relentless. A Harvard law graduate, now a high-profile civil rights attorney, Jalen had built his reputation by dismantling systemic injustice case by case, word by word. His suits were tailored, his tone always measured, but behind his brown eyes was a fire that had been lit by stories just like his father's. And this one was personal. "They didn't just question you, Dad," he said after hearing every detail. "They humiliated you. In public. And they would have kept going if you hadn't thrown a check in their face. This isn't about proving you had the money. It's about holding them accountable for the way they treated you before they ever saw the check." Calvin paused on the line. "Son, I'm not looking to sue anybody just to make noise. I just want to forget it and move on." Jalen leaned forward in his chair. "You've earned that jet with decades of hard work. But this isn't about just you. It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel small when they walked into a place they had every right to be. And I won't let it slide." What Calvin didn't know, what few people knew, was that across the showroom, a quiet ally had been watching. Her name was Tanya Brooks, a junior sales assistant who had just joined the company 6 months prior. She was young, black, and ambitious, and had spent her first few weeks swallowing her discomfort at the way some of her colleagues talked behind closed doors. But what she witnessed that day shook her. She'd stood near the back, horrified as the insults flew and the laughter rippled around the room. But when Calvin revealed the check and walked out, something shifted inside her. That night, she transferred the audio recording she'd captured, every sneer, every joke, every cruel assumption, to a secure drive. And when the lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later by Jalen Rhodes and Associates, she anonymously submitted the evidence. The trial began with media frenzy. Headlines read, "Farmer Sues Luxury Jet Showroom Over Racial Discrimination," and "From Mississippi to the Sky, One Man Stand Against Prejudice." The courtroom was packed, reporters, legal experts, curious citizens, and representatives from both jet companies. Calvin sat quietly in the front row in a navy suit, hands folded, his face composed. Jalen stood at the plaintiff's table, sharp as a blade. Across the aisle sat the company's legal team, flanked by Travis himself, now visibly nervous, stripped of his smugness, his eyes darting every time someone whispered near him. Jalen's opening statement was calm, factual, but heavy with purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, pacing slowly, "this case isn't about money. It's about respect. My father walked into a place he had every legal right to be. He came to make a purchase. He came prepared, educated, and determined. What he found was not a showroom, but a stage for mockery. What he received was not service, but scorn. Not because of what he said. Not because of what he did. But because of what he looked like." The defense tried to spin the story as a misunderstanding. They blamed protocol, confusion, and even suggested Calvin had been overly sensitive. But then Jalen played the recording. The room went silent as the courtroom speakers filled with the unmistakable voices of Travis and others. Bet he's just here to take pictures. He probably thinks this is some kind of charity giveaway. Maybe he wandered in from the cotton fields. Laughter followed in the background. Then came the line that drew gasps from the gallery. This place is for real buyers, not dreamers in dirty boots. Jalen stood still as the audio ended. Then he turned to the jury, his voice low but piercing. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not misunderstanding. That's contempt. And it happened in broad daylight, inside a business that claims to serve the elite, but treats dignity like a luxury. Travis was called to the stand, where he squirmed under Jalen's questioning. Do you recall speaking to Mr. Rhodes when he entered the showroom? Yes. Did you assume he wasn't a buyer? I had no way of knowing. Yet you told him he should try the used car parts store down the street, correct? I didn't mean, you said it, sir. It's on the tape. What did you mean? He had no answer. The judge, a middle-aged black woman with years of courtroom experience, watched silently, her expression unreadable, but her eyes said enough. She knew what this was. In the end, the verdict was clear. The court ruled in favor of Calvin Rhodes. The judge ordered the company to pay $500,000 in damages and legal fees, issue a public apology on all media channels, and, perhaps most importantly, undergo a mandatory overhaul of staff training, diversity education, and workplace accountability. But Calvin didn't smile when the ruling came down. He simply nodded once, his eyes wet but proud. Because justice, real justice, wasn't about applause. It was about restoration. 3 months later, Calvin returned to Atlanta International, not to make a scene, but to finish something. He walked back into that same hangar, not with boots covered in mud, but in clean work shoes and a crisp jacket. The same eyes that had once laughed now looked away. Travis was nowhere in sight. But Calvin wasn't there for him. He stepped past the Falcon 2000, the one he now owned, and into the office of the rival jet company. The staff there welcomed him like an old friend. He signed the final delivery documents, shook hands, and took a moment to gaze through the window as his aircraft was rolled out onto the tarmac. Its polished body glinted in the sun, but what gleamed brighter was the message it carried. Outside, as the jet prepared for takeoff, Calvin's family stood waiting. His wife held his hand, their fingers locked in a quiet triumph. Jalen stood beside them, no longer the lawyer, just a proud son. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, Calvin looked out the window at the receding city below. His journey hadn't just taken him from field to flight, it had taken him through fire, and he had come out flying. His dream had not only taken off. It had carried with it a truth that could no longer be ignored. This wasn't just his victory. It was a message to every person who'd ever been dismissed, doubted, or demeaned. That dreams, when rooted in self-worth, watered by resilience, and shielded by dignity, could rise, no matter the weight of prejudice trying to hold them down. Sometimes, the most powerful statements are made not with raised voices, but with quiet resolve, calm dignity, and unshakable belief in one's worth. Calvin Rhodes didn't walk into that showroom to prove anything to anyone. He walked in with a dream, decades in the making, and a heart full of purpose. But what he faced was the harsh reality that so many still endure. The moment someone looks at you and sees only your skin, your clothes, or your roots, and not your value, your story, or your humanity. This story, though fictional, is inspired by thousands of real lives. People who've been told by society, directly or indirectly, that they don't belong. People who've been underestimated because they don't look the part. But as Calvin showed us, respect is not earned through appearance, it's affirmed by character. His response to disrespect wasn't aggression, it was self-assurance. His rebuttal wasn't shouted, it was written in bold ink on a check earned through years of sweat and perseverance. If you take anything away from Calvin's journey, let it be this: never allow someone else's ignorance to make you question your own worth. Your dreams are not limited by the stereotypes others place on you. You don't have to change who you are to belong, you only need to stand firm in what you know to be true about yourself. And to those watching from the outside, let this also be a reminder: what you assume about others reveals more about you than about them. Every person who walks into a room deserves the benefit of respect. Not because they have to earn it, but because we all do. To our incredible listeners across the country and the world, thank you for joining us for this story. At U.S. Daily Story, we believe in telling narratives that shine a light on injustice, resilience, and the power of human dignity. If this story moved you, if you saw even a piece of your own struggle in Calvin's, we invite you to share it with others. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And remember, where you come from may shape you, but it never defines the limits of where you can go. Thank you for listening. Stay strong, stay proud, and always walk tall.